Hello, welcome to this communications training organized by the Combine Project and the AMR Accelerator. So today we're going to talk a little bit about communicating your expertise. We call this a primer for becoming a popular scientist. It's a training that we do for PhD students and researchers at Uppsala University and also in some other European projects. So today, I want to talk a little bit about media, the risks and benefits of communicating science, and also build your capacity on how to build a popular science narrative, how to adapt to your audience, and offer a little bit of media training. So this tweet, I think, captures it all. We often talk about a general public. We can't just simply reach them. We have an idea of a general public, but in reality, it's an overlapping plethora of publics with experts in your own field that understand almost as much as you, your parents, your children, your partner, who probably understand a lot more than experts in neighboring fields or the experts, generalists in the same domain even, or experts in other domains. So there are lots of audiences. Some will understand when we communicate the same way we do to peers. Some will be requiring plain language. Some will actually not believe us even if we communicate in plain language because they have a different set of beliefs, like flat earthers, for example, that you see in this little figure. So what we want to do today is give you a recipe for communications about why you might want to have publicity in the first place, focus a little bit on the rules that govern media, and emphasize that you need to know why you engage with media before you do, and say that you should come prepared. And that's why I also tried to teach you today how to build a good story, prepare for an interview, and deal with difficult questions. And more importantly, also what to do in case there's negative publicity. So the recipe for communications that I'm offering together with Anna Holm from Uppsala University is basically stating a fact about the world or context, creating a frame, explain why your work is important in relation to that, and then you send a message based on sound research and call to action, and you do that in plain language. And that's an easy way to write about science, but also a way to talk about science. So at Lund University in Sweden, they've developed guidelines with principle for good research communications that I think is useful. They focus on correctness, relevance, uncertainty, research status, authorship, perspective, and conflict of interest. And they say they do this because it's in the interest of researchers, the university, and society, that findings and insights on methodology and limitations are made accessible for debate, decision-making, the business community, and society as a whole. And I think the key word here is transparency. And there are other ways of looking at transparency. This is the League of European Research Universities note on good practice for communicating animal research at universities, where they say that the general public opinion is divided on the use of animals in research. And they say that that could be due to a lack of openness and transparency about why and how animals are used in research, and a lack of awareness of the stringent rules and regulations that govern these kinds of experiments. So transparency can play a role for public acceptance, public understanding, and in turn, that can play a role when it comes to buy-in and uptake of innovations coming out of research and European projects like the Combine projects and the other projects in the AMR Accelerator. But media has a different logic. You can be correct and we can report on all the relevant circumstances, clarify methods, point to any uncertainty. You can position your results in relation to the status of the field. You can report on all of the authors, all of the contributors, anyone who reviewed. You can be very clear about your own expertise and perspective when you engage in debate. And you can state any potential conflict of interest. But at the end of the day, a tweet only fits 280 characters. So the question is, how are you going to make sure that you are transparent? So the sad truth here is really that people don't really care about your methods. What we want to know as publics, so people who are not actually wanting to cite your results or build on them, we want to know how your results will impact us. And the journalist won't risk boring their audience with the details that your peers might be interested in a seminar or a conference. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't adhere to those ethical principles about good good research communication principles. But you need to understand that media is a set of arenas that have special rules, and science needs to adapt to fit to this media landscape. You might have heard that term. It comes from media ecology theory, describing how media technology and communication affect our environment, claiming that media is acting as an extension of our senses, and that communication technology is the primary cause of social change. And if you look at book printing as one of the most disruptive technologies, that sort of explains what's meant by this. It's called ecology because it describes an environment. It's the environment where you use the medium, what those media are, and then how they affect society. So basically, creates a landscape also for science communication where you input your research agenda and your research results into this ecology, this landscape of different kinds of media, traditional print media. You also have digital and social media, but more importantly, you have all of the devices that we use to access those different media, the technologies, we're now on YouTube where you see this presentation, but there's also going to be devices like a mobile phone is going to be very different from a TV screen or from a big computer screen. So even the format changing from portrait to landscape and landscape to portrait changes the way you need to communicate. So then the other aspect of this is what happens in media. There's a process called mediatization. If you compare that to globalization or modernization, it makes sense. Where mass media is influencing society, it's influencing everything, culture, politics, education, sports, but of course also science. And it's forcing everyone, so politicians, civil society, journalists and scientists, to adapt how they communicate. And that means changing your message and style so it suits mass media. And when you do that, hype and hyperbole plays a big part in driving the adoption of technology. So that means exaggeration is often used for marketing new innovations. It's focusing on the perceived value of a trend or innovation, but that also happens in science communication. So when I'm recording this, it's about 2 years after the launch of the Clubhouse app. Everyone was using it, everyone talked about it, and then a couple of years later, no one's using it anymore, so we don't even recognize it. So much of the hype of science actually comes from scientists themselves. And if we look at the example of genetics and genomics, there was an aim for public acceptance and interest from research funding agencies when scientists first started sequencing the human genome, the HUGO project, for example. And then there was a lot of hype and a lot of interest from politicians, research funders, from society. But what happens if the public buys the hype around biotechnology and genetic and genomic research in particular? It can affect public acceptability. So in the case of genetics and genomics, if genetics information is described as special and of great significance, you might start believing that genetic information is special and different from any other health data or personal information. And then you might become more cautious about donating samples for research, and that makes it more difficult to do research. So that's a sort of example from science, how it can affect science. So the way that media frames and describes science has an impact on society. And if mediatization is shaping the way that researchers communicate, we need to acknowledge that the media landscape also changes the way we communicate. It creates new arenas for science communication. And journalists and PR professionals like myself are no longer mediating the communication. We live in a post-scientific, post-fact or post-truth society where you can do this yourself. So the question is if that's a problem for science communication. I think we need to first sort of differentiate between the rules that govern different kinds of media. So first of all, there's the difference in the ethical and legal status, where traditional media is governed by press ethics. You have publishers that can be held responsible. You have professional ethics for content producers. So journalists and PR professionals have their own ethical codes and organizations. And then on the other hand, you have social media platforms and other platforms where you can share content that have policies in terms of and conditions for the platform, but they're not responsible for the user's content. So you are liable yourself. And then it's a question of accessibility, availability, and filtering. So traditional media, you have editors that can decide what should be published. And of course, they're also the ones who are liable. But what they do is they pick content for a pre-existing audience. So you need to adapt to their style if you want to communicate through their platforms. And then anyone can start a podcast, a YouTube channel, or a Twitter account. But what you need to do then is to build an audience for your own content. So the benefit is that scientists can communicate with the public and different kinds of research stakeholders directly. But the risk is that you're actually competing with facts that are generated, interpreted, or presented by others in a time where science is no longer considered truth. And then, of course, you're liable in case, for example, you defame someone. So we need to address echo chambers, filter bubbles, and the problem of balancing views. So, for example, if you want to believe that the Earth is flat, you will, regardless of what the fact says. And if you're in this kind of echo chamber, your beliefs will be amplified and reinforced by communication, regardless of whether that's supporting your worldview or in conflict with your worldview. And that's a problem for science communication. It's a practical problem because we won't reach those reluctant audiences. And even if we do, they won't believe us. So the question is then whether you should start including those opposing views in your narrative, because this might be a way of sort of, if you address someone, for example, who's skeptic to vaccines, if you address their worldview in your narrative, or if it's about climate change, there are different views on the causes of that. Well, if you include those both opposing views, you might provide a false balance, what's also called both sidesism. Because even if balance has virtues, sometimes all sides don't deserve equal weight. So if journalism or your own narrative gives all viewpoints the same scientific legitimacy, so that's what it can be perceived as you giving it the same scientific legitimacy. If you give both sides equal space, you give them equal weight. And if you think of science as a activity that examines evidence and builds on the hypothesis that has the most support, you end up in a situation where it's no longer clear who the expert is, and then perhaps also what drives their narrative. If they are being transparent about correctness, relevance, uncertainties, research status, authorship, everything. So we need to make sure that we are being transparent and that we're not including two viewpoints and giving them equal weight, unless, of course, they deserve that. So what this has all been building up to is the fact that we need to make choices. If you know what you want to achieve, it's much easier. You need to ask yourself if you're contributing to hype, if you're building or eroding trust in your work in science in the field. Think about who might want to use your results and for what purpose. Whose language are you using? If you're taking a stand, that can be intentional or unintentional, but you need to be clear about it. And whether you're both sidesing. And if you know that you're doing it, you need to know why. And whether you've identified any personal risks, security risks, for example, if you're talking about animal data, and whether you picked the right channel. So then we want to be good. But when we want to be good and we try to be good, we also need to pay attention. So if you strive for inclusiveness and representation, that comes with a risk, because you might be picking sides in polarized debates, or you might also use people as tokens. If you want to represent an audience and you search diversity with stock images of diversity, you end up with images that might not represent your audience. And if you try to avoid risk, that also comes with risk. If you're downplaying something important, you're trying to write yourself out of trouble, you might not be fully transparent. And then if you're being transparent, that also comes with risk, because there are polarized debates and people might object. There are vaccine skeptics. There are people who are very concerned about the use of animals in research, for example. And we have to accept the fact that we can't always control the narrative. So scientific narratives are also part of popular debates. And I think some of you have seen this tweet by J.K. Rowling that started a big discussion on inclusive language on the internet. And if you know anything about that debate, You might also be familiar with this cover by The Lancet that received a lot of attention. So The Lancet did an issue on period poverty and menstrual shame, which is very, very important, of course. But what they did was also pick a quote for the cover that came from a perspective in that issue that says, historically, the anatomy and physiology of bodies with vaginas have been neglected. So that comes from this exhibition called Periods on Display. And what happened after was the editor-in-chief had to make an apology, where he writes that in this instance, we have conveyed the impression that we've dehumanized and marginalized women. Those who read The Lancet regularly will understand that this would never have been our intention. I apologize to our readers who were offended by the cover quote and the use of those same words in the review. At the same time, I want to emphasize that transgender health is an important dimension of modern healthcare, but one that remains neglected. So what happened here is two important issues sort of were mixed together with the use of that language in the cover quote in an issue that dealt with menstrual shame and period poverty. And then you have two different audiences who have two different views on language and needs for language. So if it's that difficult, the question is why you should bother. Well, in the end of the day, it's all about impact. You can have scientific impact, societal impact, and economic impact through publicity. A tweet can help peers discover your work, it gives you a citation, it also gives you altmetric, increases your altmetric score of your publication. Public understanding might support public acceptance and uptake of your innovations, and being understood can support technology transfer. It's good PR for the university, for your company, for projects, for funders, but it's also a powerful opportunity as a researcher, as a scientist, to spread your own message. And it can position yourself as someone with expertise, and it could make you accessible. And it's an opportunity to give back to society, because at the end of the day, a lot of, especially academic research, is funded by taxpayers. So if you need to want to do publicity after all of these warnings, you should start by asking yourself if you want to inform or influence, and how you can balance opposing views in your own writing. If there's a way where you can avoid alienating audiences, how you can reach different audiences. Maybe you need to do two different kinds of communications if you want to reach two different audiences. What you can do and what you can win by being open and transparent about controversial topics. And if you are, how you can put some risk mitigation strategies in place, and how you can be transparent about scope and limitations in very different formats. Again, there's only 280 characters in a tweet, but you can always post the link to your published paper. If that's open access, it's an opportunity to be transparent in that. So I would say it's two different routes. You can do get publicity for your conclusions by talking about your results. So typically that's when we send a press release or we tweet about a publication. Or you can raise awareness and generate interest in your research questions by talking about why your research is important. You can do that in editorial opinion, giving an expert interview, or you can write a blog post, and you can use your own social media to get attention. And if you want your results to have impact, you can send, of course, a press release. That's a very particular process, making sure that journalists receive this. They subscribe to databases like Euric Alert and Alpha Galileo. You can also contact a trusted journalist ahead of publication, but news media is not always the most effective way to have impact. You can use new media, so in contrast to mass media or traditional media, so they're not so new anymore. You can give decision makers good arguments in a policy brief, for example. You can get yourself invited to the meetings where your input is needed. You can engage stakeholders in a webinar. You can organize another public-facing event. You can write editorial for a journal, for a blog, for a daily, local, national newspaper. Get on someone's podcast. You can publish something in your organization's newsfeed. Just make sure that you pick your channel that gets your message across to the right audience, and make sure that you always amplify your message through social media. So why should you care then about new media? because podcast, blogs, and social have a much lower threshold, and they also reach specific stakeholder groups. And they also build your altmetric score. And if you're not familiar with this, it's a way to measure visibility. Altmetric can be used as a key performance indicator. So if the DOI link to a publication is posted, you have little spiders walking around the web collecting those, and you can monitor the conversation that's going on about your work. And then there's this colorful ribbon that indicates where you're getting the attention. The blue one, which is the one we often see, is Twitter. We also often see a yellow, which is for blogs, and red is for news. Altmetric doesn't capture all news coverage of research because they don't always publish the DOI link. And if it's in print or if it's on TV, you don't even get an opportunity to collect the DOI link. So communications, I would say, is a different approach to talking about your results. And it's so different from your regular scientific narrative, where in a traditional scientific dissemination, you would use academic language. That's the language that fits your field. You report on your method, you focus on very small differences, filling gaps in a field, ending with a conclusion, using a more rational tone, and often it builds on consensus. Whereas in a communication, to be effective, you need to use plain language, and you need to tell a story that goes from A to B, focus on the big picture and the context. You start with a conclusion because that's what draws people in to the story. You include emotion, and often as a way of getting more dynamic in your communication, you can portray opposing views. So that means you need to turn your narrative around. So if this is for writing, I would say the conclusion, basically the first 25, 30 words summarizes your whole story, focusing on what's new or different about your results if you're writing about a published paper, for example. And then you need to include key messages to explain why this is important for your audience. Those messages will be different for different audiences. If it's for a general population, if you're going for national news, the key message needs to be focused on why this is important to me. What kind of impact will your results have on me? If it's for experts in your field, it might be more sort of how do you apply these results? What actions do you need to take? And then you explain, you need to have some evidence to back up your claims. And if you want to provide details, consider putting like a fact box at the end. So when you communicate, the context is key. You need to prime your audience, you need to frame the issue, you need to explain what you've done, prove your point, and you need to do that in plain language. So basically you tell people why this is important, give them the context so they can understand, and then you give them evidence by reporting on your results. And plain language, we've all heard that. It's a way of communicating that's to the point without convoluting. And it's writing or speaking in a way that allows people to understand at once. So the first time they read it or the first time they hear it. Language on web also raises demands. We have the European Union's Web Accessibility Directive that's becoming law across Europe, requires that we all provide equal access to the internet for anyone who's experiencing disability. That can be permanent, temporary, or situational. And that's everything from someone who uses a screen reader. If you're blind or dyslexic, you might need a screen reader. You might need captioned video if you can't hear, for example. You might need keyboard navigation. You might not have computer experience. You might be on your phone, so the big landscape screen doesn't display the same in a portrait mobile phone. You might need magnification, and you might need clear links and structure for different reasons. That means we need to move beyond readable to perceivable when we do digital communications. So that means you need to provide alternatives to images, video, and audio content by subtitling. That's called closed captions. Describe images. So if you mouse over or you have a screen reader, they can sort of tell you what's on the image. You need to transcribe, or at least if someone requests transcriptions of audio, you need to be able to deliver that. And it needs to be adaptable. So content can be presented in different ways. So again, if you're on a widescreen landscape monitor, very, very different what kinds of diagrams and tables you can make people use than if you're on a mobile device, where that's going to be portrait and very, very small. So the content should be presented in different ways without losing information or structure, and that's really tricky. This is being called the death of the Venn diagram. And then you need to ensure that content is distinguishable. So the colors work for colorblind and that there's enough contrast. So think about that when you do color legends. Don't put green and red next to each other, but the best way to test if it has enough contrast is just print it in grayscale. And if you can still see it, and if you can still read it, it's going to work also for people with different kinds of color blindness. You need to make sure that audio is distinguishable, and you can't put any image of text. So don't write on an image and expect people to read. If you do that, you need to put that in an alt, sort of in a code that people can, screen readers can still see what's on that image, because we can't rely on everyone using their eyesight. And also, if you're moving from a big screen to a small screen, a lot of that information might get lost. So good writing then becomes accessible when you build clear structures. So you need to have headings. You can't just put like a bigger font and bold, because that doesn't work for someone who's navigating with a screen reader or tabbing their way through a document. You need to have clear links. You need to have headings. You need to describe images, audio, and video. Text content must be readable and understandable. And you should avoid abbreviations and unusual or difficult words. So any jargon needs to go. And you need to make sure that links work in screen readers. I'm going to give you an example. So what you see when you look at this text, watch this video about cooking in 18th century America, or read more about cool cats and kittens, a screen reader will only see video and read more. And typically with a screen reader, you read the text and then you get the links at the end. And in a long text, there might be several read more, read more, read more. And it makes us, we have to rethink the way we structure text that's going to be on web. So if you instead link in the sort of content-bearing part of the sentence, so in this case, cooking in 18th century America and cool cats and kittens, a screen reader, it will be very easy for me to understand what's behind that link. And that's what we want. We want to make sure that people from the heading can understand what's going to be in the paragraph underneath, and from the link will know what happens when I click it. So in some cases, this requires that you restructure your texts. So plain language, you can use that by having your audience in mind, using an active voice, addressing your reader in the first person, sticking to one idea per paragraph. If it's really short, it works very well for web. And in particular, again, on a mobile device, we don't want to scroll too much. You keep your sentences short. Remember that most people are not native English speakers, and move away from jargon and use common words that we can all understand. It sounds easy, but if common terms are not precise enough, you need to take the time to explain. This is an example from an IMI project called Conception, where we're talking about pregnancy outcomes. And that's a difficult word for people outside of the medical field to understand. So we're giving some examples then: stillbirth, child being small for the time. And that's also something that has a very particular meaning. So we say gestational age for the audience that this is a news about a published paper. But we want to use those terms as well to help the reader. So in this case, we're aiming for women who have migraines and who are pregnant. So they need to know what kinds of terms to Google to get the scientific results, the evidence they need to take decisions or to make sure that they're informed, but they also need to understand what it means. So it's easy when you think about it to use plain language, but also cater to the need to be precise by making sure that you use both styles, both your terminology and an explanation that helps the reader understand. And don't forget to frame, because the context here is key. Why is this important? It's important because migraines are the third most common disease in the world, and women are 3 times more likely to suffer from migraines. And that's why we want to study migraine medicines in pregnancy and breastfeeding. So if you then want to check if this worked, I would suggest you ask a non-native speaking teenager to read, because if they can understand, most of your audiences will. And then you can also test your text with the readability index. But remember that those are blunt tools that just count words and the sentence length. And they can never test if your text can actually be understood. So I suggest using a human for that still, even if AI is getting better. Okay, so now we get to part 2, which is the training part of this, building capacity to communicate about your research. So I want to give you some tips and tricks for writing yourself and when you engage with journalists. If you're not planning an interview or communicating in writing, you can use the same tips in other contexts. So it's not going to be a waste. So don't worry if a journalist contacts you. You actually don't have to answer questions. There's no obligation, and you're only the spokesperson for your own research and your own results. And you can always point to someone who is a spokesperson if you don't want to answer questions yourself. If you do engage, just be wary of bias, off-topic, or widely framed questions. And if you can't answer, help identify the right person. And if there's an interview you did that didn't go well, or if you spotted negative publicity, get your organization's press office and project leadership involved, and then let them appoint a spokesperson and deal with it. And if something happened, if there was negative publicity, we can do something about it. Of course, you can ask for a correction, but the message is already out there. So normally, if you ask for a correction, they will print in the paper the day after that there was a mistake in the reporting. But if you've been misrepresented, you can talk to your comms people in the press office, and they can help you mitigate any communication risks by helping you spread your message in channels that reach the same audience. So basically, you can share your key message in maybe an editorial text or an opinion. It can be in a journal, it can be on a blog, it can be in a newspaper. You can give an interview or a statement to a journalist that you trust, and you can join forces and issue statements as a collective if there are several experts in neighboring fields, for example. And then you can use social media to spread that message. And when you communicate, this is a little reminder. So engaging with journalists or writing, whatever you do, know why you're doing it. Don't provide all of the details because you're not the audience. You write for your audience and in the style that fits the channels. You write for them and not for yourself. And then focus on why your research is important to them. And when you write or speak about research, instead of sort of disseminating your results, you need to put what's most important first, explain what's new and why that matters, and then a reminder of this recipe. A useful communication will state a fact about the world or context, and it will explain why your work is important in relation to that. Send a message based on your research, call to action, and do that in plain language. And then you need to adapt whatever you're doing to the media landscape and to whatever channel you're using. If you're writing a press release, a news item or something like that, a news style, or if you're writing a blog telling a story, if you have a clear and click-worthy headline that will, you know, I should, as a reader, or be able to understand what's behind that when I click. And then you start with the conclusion. You let the introduction summarize the whole story. You stick to 2 or 3 key messages, not more than that, because we don't want people to work too hard. You explain what's new or different about your findings, why that's important to the audience, and then you provide answers to the most likely questions, the same you would when you're presenting your results or your research in a conference or webinar or seminar. Don't include all of the details, but you provide enough evidence to back your claims. And then there are 2 kinds of evidence in communication. There's hard evidence, like the facts and statistics that you need to provide when you publish your results. But there's also soft evidence, like personal stories and anecdotes, and they can help you get your message across. And then the headline is what sells a story. It should be eye-catching, believable, easy to read. So that's plain language. It should be brief and accurate and use an active voice. And it should be appropriate for the target audience. So these are a couple of examples. This is from an AMR project called Prefer, with a publication that says an overview of critical decision points in the medical product lifecycle, Where to include patient preference information in the decision-making process. That's 3.5 lines. And if it's on a mobile device, it's going to be even more compressed. And then my colleague Anna Holm has shortened that to 15 ways to listen to the patient voice. And because it is a list of 15 such decision points where you can include patient preference information in decision making. That's accurate, and it's brief, and it's also speaking to us because we like that. Numbers like in spring, you normally see these big headlines saying 5 ways to lose 5 kilos before the 5-week holiday or something like that. These numbers trigger something in us. So it's then, but it's still true. So it's not clickbaiting. So you need to build your story using key messages. They are the building blocks of your story. Never include more than 2 or 3 messages, because then you're making the audience work too hard. Limit yourself to what's most important. If you have a lot of things to say, consider dividing it into 2 separate stories instead of getting it all in there. And those key messages, they're clear, they're concise and succinct, and they're powerful and well-framed. Of course they are, but they're also conversational, so they're adapted to your audience in plain language. So the tone of conversation that they use to engage in, if you align your values with their values and you align your language with their language, it's going to be much, much easier to get your message across. So when you adapt to your audience, they want to know how your findings impact them. So you need to align with their language and with their values, but you also need to remove enough abstraction to reach a level that suits them. So what you need to do is to refer to your results instead of reciting them. Being conversational will help you do that, and then avoid jargon and acronyms at all costs, because the meaning can differ even between the most adjacent fields. And then you need to choose the right channel. So if you know what you want to achieve and you know who you want to reach, you need to figure out where you can reach them. And that, of course, depends on why you communicate. And different channels have different benefits and downsides. If you have your own social media accounts, for example, they give you control, but not always the reach. And if you have a channel with a big reach, they often have gatekeepers like editors who might want to change the style or the message of your communication. So always look at your objectives. Why are you doing it? Who do you want to inform or influence? Where can you find them? And what is the best way to speak to them? But communication, we've been talking a lot about text. It's much more than text. An image can reinforce your message, but it can also get you into trouble. So you need to be as careful about choosing your images as you are of choosing your words. And here, representation is very important, where you should avoid tokenism at all costs. So if you can't do representation and inclusion well, don't do it at all. And be mindful of copyright. So when you use images, make sure that they're free to use and acknowledge the photographer. If you go to places like Pixabay, Pexels, and Unsplash, they're really good sources to find images that are in the public domain and that are free to use. But you can't just source images from the internet anywhere by going through Google Images. It can actually cost you if you infringe on someone's copyright. So then we get to that was talking about images, but now we're talking about engaging with journalists when you have someone else setting the agenda. When you engage with journalists, it requires you to deliver like a pro. You need to understand the rules of engagement. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks. If someone wants an interview, take a look at what they've done before. Research a journalist's previous work before you accept the interview, and then find out what the angle is. What you can do is to ask who else is featured in the article, and then you come prepared. You have a press release in your head. And remember that there is no such thing as off the record. So what you need to do is to prepare for the soundbite. And warning, soundbite is jargon. That means, quote, never use jargon or acronyms. And make sure that your key messages delivered as good quotes. If they're not, they might not end up in the piece about your work, or they might be your piece might be scrapped. So you should help journalists quote you by preparing clear, well-framed, and conversational key messages. So you try and say the same thing in different contexts, in different language. and hopefully one or two of them will be picked up. So if you deliver like a pro, what you do is you arrive with those messages ready and you repeat them again and again. So basically all of this writing focus that we had so far, it's the same preparation process. You arrive with that press release ready in your head. And then at the end of it, you have to remember that it's now not yours anymore. It's the journalist's text or recording or video, whatever it is. You have no right to it, but if there's time, you can ask to review your quotes, and normally they will let you do that. So always dress, always think about what you're wearing. Print journalists might want to take a picture. If it's on radio, it might be video broadcasted online. And if it's TV, and then you would know. When we say dress to impress, we'll get a little bit to some sort of concrete advice, but it's also microphone etiquette. So don't move around relative to a microphone. We're now so used to having microphones attached to headsets that we're sort of used to being able to move our heads. But if you're if you have a microphone in front of you, you need to direct your voice towards the microphone. You can't move your head around. Also, always assume that you're being recorded, and remember with that in mind that there is no such thing as off the record. So you try to relax and you stay confident and calm and conversational, use plain language, and dress appropriately. And that means, of course, there's this sort of visual impression, but also don't wear any noisy clothes or jewelry. If you have a big beard, be very careful if you have little microphones, because that sound of the microphone scratching against your beard is terrible. And the same with bangles, big earrings, noisy necklaces. And then if you're being recorded with a camera, always assume that you're on camera. If you're in a context with a camera, with a camera present. Also, of course, ignore the camera. No one likes someone staring like that. So one tip for that is if you have the camera is pointing at you, maybe you have a reporter standing next to the person with a camera, look them in the eye. It gives you a much more relaxed gaze. If there is no one interviewing you, you can just ask a friend or someone else to stand next to the person with the camera, look them in the eye. It will give you somewhere to fix the gaze, and speaking to a person will also make you much more relaxed. So for example, when we're doing things like this, when it's recorded online, we're not speaking to a person, we're speaking to a computer, and then it does something with the way we engage with our gaze. And sometimes looking in different directions or looking down and not looking so engaged. So try and look at a person. You can also, if you're speaking, then you can try and look at yourself. And if you look at yourself, you're speaking to a person. So make sure that there's someone to try and direct your talk to. And then if there's makeup being offered, say yes, because in a studio, we have very, very bright lights. You will look tired, regardless of how much you slept that night. And it's much, much easier to trust someone who looks like they're rested. And then when it comes to clothing, don't wear pinstripe shirts, more pattern, shiny clothes. Block colors are much better. And this is because of strobing. So a camera is not as clever as a human eye. So I think we've all seen that kind of effect, especially with pinstripe shirts, where you get when the person with the shirt moves, it doesn't move the same way. The pattern doesn't move the same way. That's called strobing. So sit up straight, gesture normally. And when I say normally, it's sort of trying to stay in the frame that the camera is catching. So if you wave your arms outside of frame, it looks strange. And if you're waving your arms in front of your face, you're also losing some of the connection with whoever's watching. If it's live, come prepared. What you need to do is to speak slowly to get your message across. You keep your cool, you're always polite, you're never on the defense, and you learn how to answer difficult questions. And that's going to be a little prep coming here. So if you want time to prepare, what you can do if a journalist is contacting you is you can just say that you're in a meeting or you're about to go to a meeting, and then ask to see the questions, have them emailed to you and call back. And if it's not about your work per se, and if you don't want to make a comment, you can point to a spokesperson. So you're under no obligation to answer journalist questions. Even if they call you, you can decline an interview. And if it's something, particularly if it doesn't concern you or your work, if there's been a scandal, or there's something happened that maybe not related to your work, unless you want to comment, you can point to a spokesperson. And if you end up in an uncomfortable interview, you need to make sure that you object to any bias or error. So never let any controversial or unjustified assumptions slide. And if people are asking you to confirm something that's damaging, don't do that unless they have proof to show you. And if they do, you need to acknowledge that proof. But avoid blame. Don't get drawn into criticism, and stop talking, because over-answering is what gets you into trouble. And journalists are very good at that, sort of creating the awkward silence. So you ask a question, and then if you want someone to sort of tell you more, they just stay quiet. So we need to be able to deal with that awkward silence, or figure out a way to sort of move on to the next question. And then I would say, don't say no comments. That's basically an admission of guilt. So keep your cool, take your time to answer, and you can always ask to review your quotes. Again, they might not let you review the full story. And if you get difficult questions, what you need to do is to anticipate them the same you would anticipate difficult questions at a conference or a seminar, and you prepare answers ahead of time. You can get help from your press office, from the comms team in your organization or the project that you're working. And what you want to do is to bridge to positive messages, but that's only if you don't want to or if you cannot answer, because journalists and the people watching, we're not stupid. We know when you're avoiding a question. We've seen politicians do this all the time. But if you want to sort of answer difficult questions, what you need to do is to make sure that you're clear, consistent, and you're accurate, and you're foremost honest. If you give a weak response, that's avoiding the answer, saying something like, unfortunately, I can't discuss that. Do you have any other questions? But that's still being clear, consistent, accurate, and honest. If you want to offer a strong response, what you need to do is to acknowledge the issue and then bridge to a positive message. So you can say something like, we know of this issue, yes. At this time, however, it's no longer relevant because now we're focusing on, and then you bridge and you introduce something else. So those are skillful answers. You need to show that you understood the question by acknowledging it, and you need to bridge to a key message, and you need to control, and you need to contribute. And if you're a pro, what you can also do is to dangle and distract with something completely different. So saying something like, we know the issue, we're looking into it. At the time, the bigger issue, however, is this, how these developments or these findings will change how we eat sausage on weekdays or whatever. It needs to be credible so people take the bait. And these are some examples from mediafirstco.uk. So you can just pick and mix, right? So that's how, not how I see it. The key thing to remember is something, or that's a concern. But what I do know is we need to confirm all the facts before I can talk about that in detail. But what I can confirm is, so you can sort of practice some of these to make sure that you can bridge. But what you need to do is to first always be honest, acknowledge the question. So if you want more attention, getting a big interview with a journalist might not be the route for everyone, and it might not always be in line with your communication objective, but you can use your own social media. You can share your publications and you can contribute to the discussion on Twitter, on LinkedIn. There's several places. So you need to figure out where your audience is, right? And engage with them where they are. You can write an editorial text, you can write opinion for blogs, for journals, for news media, and you can stay available. So if you've had contact with a journalist, you can give them your number and tell them that it's okay to call. So there's a sort of checklist here at the end for effective and responsible science communication. I would say is always ask yourself why you're doing this. and who you want to inform or who you want to influence, and where you can find that audience and what the best way is to speak to them. And I would just like to say thank you so much for listening to this, and hopefully we'll see you communicating your research results more in the future. Thank you.